So, first off, I'd just like to point out that on my very short commute here to the studio this morning, I almost got hit twice by errant drivers who, decided let's use the poke out method in morning rush traffic. Interesting choices. Now, the second time wasn't so bad. They were just poking out from a side street for no real reason. It wasn't like there was traffic that they needed to kind of edge their way out in order to ensure that they get a chance to get out. It was the lane opposite oncoming to me was clear, and there was no car coming behind me for quite some time. They just needed a little bit of patience, and they would have gotten through. The first time was far more egregious. Turning a corner on the savannah, the lane next to me is at a standstill for whatever reason, I don't know. My lane is free-flowing. Not oncoming, free-flowing. Because there's a car right in front of me, and I'm free-flowing right behind him. And a car to my left on the corner decides, oh, I'm going to indicate and try and poke out. And I'm like, this is not a situation where you have a window. I am right behind the next guy. So the only thing I could think of to do is mash my horn real quick to let this guy realize it's not like I could just stop. So it would be a very bad idea for you to pull out right now because we're going to have an incident. The thing is, I get it that it's tempting. You see a free-flowing lane, your lane is not moving, and you want to go. But the key point is, free-flowing doesn't mean empty. And I do wonder what is going through this person's head when they think, oh, this might be a good idea. In order for me to save 30 seconds on my drive, I'm going to, just look to see if I could pull out. It was, given that this is my daily commute, it's not something that I've had to experience every morning. There's one thing when everybody is more or less stopped and, you're trying to weave your way through traffic and you're poking to go into the next lane and what have you. Fine, I get that. Or, in the case, two parallel lanes, we're both going at a certain speed. You see a window, you're moving at the same speed that my lane is moving in, so you cut in front of me, cut behind me, whatever. That, I could see where it's reasonable and safe. This was not. This was just a bad idea. Because if you try to stick out to kind of, get yourself ready, it's the savannah. There's not a lot of room for error here. You're not pulling out of a side street where I could go wide, which is what happened to me with the other incident. I just went wide. Luckily, no one was oncoming. I'm on the inner lane of the savannah. There's no wide I could pull in case you pull out too much. But hey, everybody apparently knows better. Speaking about knowing better, I'll comment on the situation where it seems as though the school did not take reports of bullying seriously enough. I would just say one basic line on that situation, and that is, it should not be up to the students to have to deal with anything to do with bullying. And I don't think, so technically line number 2, but hey, forgive me, I don't think we have a precedent or a history of false flag operations where false accusations of bullying just goes around. It makes me wonder about the professionalism and capability and capacity of the teachers involved in this situation, and the dean and the principal of the school. It just makes me wonder. I'm not saying anything about it. I'm not proclaiming anything about it. I just have questions like much of the rest of the country. We already have children being gunned down by gangsters. We don't need children now dying basically due to bullying. But speaking about knowing better, I'd just like to find out, apparently our food import bill has gone from $5 billion to $7.3 billion. So somebody please tell me where the extra $2 billion in foreign exchange per annum just for food importation, not for any of our other needs. Remember, every car that comes in, technically, foreign exchange had to go out for that. Most of our clothes, foreign exchange had to go out for that. Our electronics, foreign exchange. Our shoes, foreign exchange. All of the doohickeys, doodads, appliances, a good chunk, if not most, of our furniture. Foreign exchange has gone for that. 2 billion extra is not necessarily something that will just grow on trees. And the thing is, if it could grow, 2022, 7.2 billion, and I think it's now 7.3 billion for 2023, I assume. How much further can it grow? And again, I do have to ask, because I get it, some people say the private sector is doing well, hence the non-energy manufacturing sector in the budget, the tax revenue based on that sector of the economy was pretty high, relatively speaking. Or maybe it's just high because scale, there's just more of it. Doesn't necessarily mean it's doing well, right? Question, food security is a big deal for the government, right? We supposedly have a good private sector, right? How come, all of these things, and there's a third point. Forex, or lack thereof, means that food security is not just important for the government, but also a potential opportunity. If someone could figure out a way to produce food efficiently enough locally that doesn't require much, if any, forex, that could potentially, in the long run, be a very lucrative business. And yet, these things do not come together in the minds of businessmen, because all apparently they know how to do is use our forex to sell us things. Buy things with forex to sell us things in TT dollars. More on that concept later. Just like I said, these things, it might not seem so bad now, right? Because we're managing. What happens when it grows to the point that we can't manage it? It's not like it's going to go from 0 to 60 overnight. It's going to be death by 1,000 cuts. The problem is, usually by the time you get to the point where there's empirical evidence, we've reached the point of no return, the key thing is, by the time you get that point of no return, it's very hard to unring a bell, to reverse course, once you get so close to the edge of the waterfall, once you are right on top of the iceberg. It's kind of rough. All right, enough of that. There's a lot to get into before I welcome my guests, so let's kick off today's Daily Review. And the first story that to get to this morning, of course, budget, right? Last week, big story, budget. And then Friday, the opposition leader spoke. Now, some people might be surprised with regards to what I'm about to say. There are some things that the opposition leader said that I could agree with, and there are some things that you said that I think I wish there was more detail or information on, or perhaps the implications of what you said I'm not necessarily liking so much. This is because she has, I guess you could say, made promises. One could argue maybe, are these election campaigning promises? And then, of course, do we hold her to account if these offerings come to pass or not? Of course, she did a pretty good PR job on it, Her reply was themed a decade of debt, deficit, destabilization, death, and destruction. Let's just pause, and if we want to go to crime, there was a whole state of emergency where something was big enough to say that it was a threat to the government for you to state of emergency, your state of emergency. Just remember, okay. So, and she also said to dedicate this to the 99%, the average citizen, who this government has abandoned, which that's a bit of hyperbole, because there will be those pockets within the 99% that the government we could objectively say they have not technically abandoned, but her response was 3 hours and 40 minutes, probably too long, but at least it was shorter than the minister's 5 hours plus. one of the things that she said that I'm not sure if I agree with, but this is more of a technical question, and I'm not necessarily going to commit to say I like it or I don't like it. I mean, to some extent, you kind of have to do math to estimate if this would be good or bad, or you implement it and see how good or bad it is. That's basically your two choices. Increasing minimum wage to public servants to $4, by $4. I think maybe the quote has to say programmer, but by $4 per hour. And the offer to public servants by 10% instead. Now, off the bat, the second part especially might seem to be wishful thinking. Because while I'm not saying that the 5% offer is fair, just, right, to be accepted easily by the unions, generally speaking, no other context, it would be questionable if you could even afford that, to be honest. Right? No other context, all things being equal, can we afford even the 5%? I have no idea. And a part of me thinks part of the reason why they said 5% this time is because it's higher than 4%, but they don't really want to say anything high. They don't really want to do an increase, but they need to kind of give a little bit more to sound a little bit better than the last time. But I actually would not doubt that if they could get away with 0%, they would. But hence the whole reason why they went from 4 to 5%. You know, last time was 4 for those 3 years. Now we're looking at 5%. Whoop-de-doo. Not to say that any increase should be poo-pooed and disregarded and declined. It should not. But to go 10%, I kind of not sure if, again, all things being equal, we could afford it. $4 per hour on the minimum wage. Here's the thing, and an economist did say that this puts pressure on the private sector. It puts pressure on the private sector, not because private sector workers are going to demand for an increase. Those on the minimum wage are going to demand to meet that same number, but rather what's going to happen, and we've seen this 14 plus years ago. Back during Mr. Manning's time, I remember it was an issue for small businesses in Trinidad and Tobago trying to compete with things like CPEP and URP. That's the rub. The labor market was disrupted by the social grants of the government because an observable reaction that could be seen across multiple societies, jurisdictions, nations, etc., is that if you give people too much money for free, they will psychologically, they might not necessarily formally ask themselves and their employers this, but psychologically, in the back of their mind, it would be, why am I going to work for like $500 extra when I could just not work? Or $1,000, or even $2,000, or even $3,000 extra. Like there comes a point in time where the extra money, if I could survive while not working, why should I work? Because remember too, working will involve wardrobe, you know, the money to commute. And then of course, you know, you need to like pack a lunch or buy food outside, so you need to have containers and go through all of that process. Or I could just stay home and avoid a lot of hassle, maybe not have as much disposable income despite saving from commuting and from work clothes and all of that jazz. But hey, I could survive, right? I could be relatively comfortable to whatever standard of living I want to be because I get to not work. That was one of the things that came to my mind when I saw the minimum wage increase for CPEP and URP, because I saw what happened under the Patrick Manning administration. We ain't even reached her former administration or current. That is just one way. That's not the be-all and end-all, right? That's not the be-all and end-all. But with that said, there was one point that she made. She also said no rate hikes, which that's even more like, I could see the argument for increased public utility rates, but I could also definitely see the argument for no increases anytime soon in public utility rates. So that's a tough one. That's a tough one. But she promised that. But the thing is, she basically said that in order to make these promises, at least some of them, right? I don't know if, haven't done the math on it, I would be surprised if the opposition have done significant math on it to estimate it out. Maybe that's something that they could have thought to do to give the argument more credence. But to some extent, it actually is not necessary. It doesn't matter in that regard to finance all of these promises because, again, out of context, all things being equal, technically speaking, we're not supposed to be able to afford extra money to public servants, extra wage increases, not increasing rates if we want to see certain things done, right? Because the government themselves, they have essentially directly or indirectly said, we need more revenue. We need to find ways to get more revenue. More on that later. So the opposition leader has an interesting point. Let's just get rid of the corruption. And then we could finance all the things because we're not going to have all the waste. I can't remember how much it was, but I think it was the procurement regulator said $5-point-something billion are just, you know, slipping through the fingers of legitimate public procurement / expenditure. It's just slipping through the cracks of whatever enforcement or accountability body that we have, which is ironic given that the deficit, at least currently, is $5 billion. That's the planned, with a D, deficit. Planned with a D, and deficit with a D. Now, to some extent, we don't know how this will math out, right? We don't know what the actual amount of money lost to corruption is, and then there's a whole debate on semantics. What classifies as corruption? Hard, large scale, you know, getting bribes and money under the table. Is that the limits of corruption, or does it include minor things like favors? Not necessarily, you know, there's one thing to bribe somebody for something, and then let's just say you were going after a contract and your bid would not win, right? Objectively speaking, your bid ain't gonna win, except, you know, some money passed on the table somewhere. That's obvious corruption. Now, let's say you wanna get, I don't know, your driver's license, and you qualify to get your driver's license. But for whatever reason, there's resistance to giving you your driver's license. So you don't necessarily pass a big wad of cash on the table, but maybe you provide a favor or something to get a document that, technically speaking, by any objective measure, you are entitled to. Is that included in corruption? I don't know. So that's part of the complications about what is corruption, right? But money slipping through will probably be the hard forms with the kickbacks. I give you the contract, your bid is technically not the winning bid, but you're gonna give me some kickbacks, so of course I want to give you the contract, right? Those kinds of things we need to stop. What is the figure to that, and then how does that figure line up to, one, the deficit? Because make no mistake, one of the interesting things is that the government is saying, well, we're gonna increase $2 an hour by public sector minimum wage and offer a 5% wage increase. It's not as though we're operating with a surplus. We're technically operating with a deficit. So it's a reasonable thing to say, the opposition leader, what she said. It's on moral principle a good idea. Let's try to clean up the corruption, and that would help finance the government's business. Achieving that's not so easy. And to what extent now are we, the voters, going to believe you when you say that that's your goal? Section 34 notwithstanding. Life sports. You know, that was what, 34 million or 20-something million? I can't remember. A stupid, ridiculous figure. Things like that. Was that corruption or mismanagement or both? To what extent will the opportunity be able to do it? And then there's the next thing. Similar to the promises of the stand your ground laws and then the subsequent follow-up with we will allow citizens to have FULs. So the implication is, how are we possibly going to process the applications that might come down the pipe if this is now government policy to say We're going to help you defend yourself. We're going to help you all get firearms. Well, you have to process all those applications. You can't just open the floodgates and just give permission for people to buy guns willy-nilly. Well, it's similar to this, right? Sorry, that's a question of timing. Probably can't do all of the applications or come close to get them done in any reasonable time frame year after year. The backlog or the pile-up will be incredible. It will be similar to this. It's one thing to say we're going to clean up corruption in order to finance or to find more money for government expenditure. This is something that a lot of people have said, you know, with just rum shop talk probably all over the country for I don't know how long, right? It's obvious. It's low-hanging fruit. It's so obvious. Why has nobody thought about it? Well, one of the things, if you actually think about implementing policies such as this is, when are you actually going to eliminate all the corruption? Are you going to get elected today and just wave a magic wand and eliminate all corruption tomorrow? It's going to be a major task, assuming you have significant buy-in by the members of your political party, the members of the opposing political party, the public administration and bureaucracy, etc., 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 etc. It's not something that's going to happen overnight. In fact, it could take an entire term of office just to scratch the surface because arguably, or at least there is the perception that there's a certain amount of corruption baked into the system due to long-term precedent of what we have tolerated for years, if not decades, well. So how do you just overturn all of that overnight? You don't. And the thing is, I don't expect the opposition leader to potentially try to frame the message that way, because that's not going to necessarily be popular. Because what that means is we're not really going to be able to afford the 10% wage increase or the $4 increase in public sector minimum wage and no rate hikes for public utilities. What it means is we wish we could do these things, but this exercise is probably going to be the main effort of my administration. But I'll tell you what, if this is something that any administration is willing to undertake, that's a hell of a lot better of a legacy project than another hotel combined with an airport that has no supporting tourism industry to actually fill these things. Because the problem is not the idea, the problem is the follow-through, the supporting infrastructure. And with regards to getting rid of corruption, all right, yes, the central idea, good. The implementation, how realistic is it? If she was a bit more realistic with her offerings, I would applaud what she said more. On principle, what she said here is correct. Practically speaking, it's not that easy. And where it potentially comes or becomes a bad faith statement is you're saying these things that will generate an emotional response by voters, most of whom are probably not thinking, how practical is it what she's saying? How realistic can she get this done in time to not just achieve getting rid of the corruption, but doing so that in the immediate to short term, we will get these financial promises done. But like I said, if any administration is willing, and it might take the entire political capital of an administration to do so, the assumption would be that you would actually have some amount of help from the other side of Parliament. Like Obamacare, it took all of Obama's political capital just to push that through, and his administration, I think, in the long run suffered because of it. Benefits notwithstanding, there were also negatives to the initiative. In this case, it might take all the political capital in order to get it done, in order to negotiate it forward. Because internal unity is mainly done for marketing and public relations. It's not a reality in either party. Can she get it done? Can she be serious about that promise and be supported not by the members of the party, but by the members of the party's executive. All of those things are not entirely clear, but I'll leave it there. The follow-up to this, and I'll just hit this next story before the break. Minister of Energy, Minister Young, he basically pointed out, to some extent rightfully, to some extent wrongfully, that the UNC, they're not necessarily offering anything with regards to new revenue for the country. And I think this also goes back to the opposition's promise to deal with corruption. Again, does the math bear out that by removing corruption, because according to the Brickham regulator, at least one figure, it might not be the entirety of it, but based off of the numbers in office, it's 5 point something billion. Well, the deficit probably is not going to stay at 5 billion, because I believe last year the planned deficit was 5 billion and it went up to about 9 billion, right? And what I always say, what we get from the Ministry of Finance as the deficit is not the total gap of what we need versus what we could afford, because then there is all of the things that technically we don't spend money on, we're just controlling expenditure, so it's not going to be in the deficit, because the deficit technically is the estimate of what we're spending, or when you get the end of year financials, what we actually spent. It does not include what we should be spending money on but can't or won't. Like, for instance, police animals, food. I'm not sure if officers are still having to spend their own money for that, but when it happened several years ago, the point is the ministry should have been spending money on that, but it wasn't. That shortfall, not in the deficit. Not spending money to maintain Coast Guard boats, technically speaking, that's not in the deficit. Not paying off contracts to contractors doing work for AFCL, we're just not paying them, that's technically not in the deficit. Not paying TNTech money, it's not on the expenditure side, it's a debt, not technically, potentially, in the deficit. So how much greater is that shortfall, is that gap between what we should be spending on and what we can spend on? It's not entirely clear. And that's why what the Minister of Energy said, that the opposition did not offer anything with regard, and I haven't, maybe the opposition leader did, indirectly or directly. I haven't gone through her response. There's only so much budget my brain could take before the emotional response of wanting to throw something at my television or computer monitor will overwhelm me. But with that said, this is an important point. Regardless of if we clean up corruption or not, regardless of if we get Dragon Gas, Manatee, Coquina or not, government needs to find non-energy revenue growth somewhere. This is for the long run. We've reached this point, and I don't know if the minister was looking at it from a long-term perspective. I think he was doing it from a short-term perspective, but I'll go a step further, assuming that that's where he was coming from, to a long-term perspective. You can't look down the line to fix things in the long run, because if you wait to do long-term fixing, it's like trying to do things at the 11th hour. It's not really long-term, is it? Like trying to study just before the exam. If you want to get things done in the long run, you need to start now, because the process is going to take some time, so you put the work in now so it actually gets done in the long run. Because if you wait to start things down the line, then you're not getting stuff done in the long run, you're getting stuff done in the very long run, the extreme long run, or the distant horizon of a future that is not definite. So I think there were some other things where, the minister will complain about the choice of words of the opposition leader. I do think that it's warranted for you to point out with regards to the potential for rate increases, because it's there, it's on the table, we know it's there. Yes, we haven't actually had a rate increase, but it's there. That doesn't mean that you can't flip the script on us next year, because the whole property tax fiasco has already kind of chewed away at your benefit of the doubt. All right. We'll continue with at least one more story. This one is interesting. I'm not too sure what to make of it. First things first, Patriotic has been complaining about the fact that they feel mistreated over the bidding process for the refinery. All right, fair enough. They've had, I think, more than one bite at the apple. All right, okay. Then the Minister of Energy came out to basically say that, look, the reason why we have discounted their bid is that apparently the group around Patriotic, they, according to the minister, submitted a document that was not true. It was about money going into, I believe it was their accounts, to basically say we have the funds available, and according to the minister who spoke to the technocrats, this document is not true. In fact, the minister has gone so far as to make the claim where he thought everything was above board and he had to ask questions to the people overseeing the bidding process. What happened here? Fake document. That's the claim. A claim that the minister said he is willing to make outside of Parliament, outside of the protection of Parliament. All right, I mean, to some extent, don't just say that in Parliament, that you're willing to repeat the claim outside of Parliament, where potentially you can be sued for slander. You can make that statement, but then you have to follow through, right? I don't know if you followed through. The thing is, this is a technical thing with regards to the refinery. And I think to some extent it could be a technical situation as to what actually happened with this document, right? I don't know for sure if what the minister said is literally the core actual truth of what happened. Not saying that the minister is lying, but just rather there's a debate on semantics of how to describe the situation. What the minister said could technically be 100% true while not necessarily being accurate, right? And that's not always the fault of the politicians. It could be the advice they were given, how they understand the situation, et cetera, maybe how a PR person is trying to tell them how to say it or spin it or what have you. What I do find interesting, and again, so like I said, I think this is a technical matter that we need more on before I myself am willing to say who's right or who's wrong in the situation, if it's really fake, if it's overblown, because Patriotic have come out and said, no, what the minister said, is wrong. But I'm not necessarily content with their explanation, because unless I have misread, it's just like a short, two daily newspapers have two short reports on it that basically say, well, Patriotic said that the minister was wrong, but not necessarily going into detail as to how he's wrong. Some detail, but not enough for me to be content. The thing is, the opposition has declined to comment on the issue, and I find that very curious. Because one of the things, and this is my opinion of the opposition, one of their faults is that they will comment on everything. They will comment on things even if they don't necessarily have all the information and come out looking stupid after the fact in hindsight. They will comment on things just because even if they're overblowing a situation, they will comment on every and anything and do what I always say, my analogy is, they throw everything at the wall, including the kitchen sink, and they don't realize that's a good way to put a hole in the wall or to lose the sink. Now, they have declined to comment, and I'm not saying that this means anything. I'm just saying that I'm curious. Maybe this is a situation where the opposition is also looking at it as like, we need more information before we comment, because the last thing we want to do is do like what we have done at times in the past and what government has also done in the past, comment on things, and then reality does not conform with our initial opinion, position, statement, and we look foolish. Kudos to the opposition for doing that. It does make me think, if perhaps they know more than we know, what is it that they know that we don't know? And maybe somebody in touch with the energy sector might also know more than what's been reported in the press and could call in later to let us know what's going on. With that said, let's take a break. When we come back, we will welcome my guest, one of the TTPS Media's ambassadors, to go into the hot seat. Stay tuned to talk about on WSND Content Capital. We'll be right back after this.
Transform your home with PCU Plus. From stylish furniture to the latest appliances, we have everything you need to create your perfect space. At PCU Plus, we offer fair prices and affordable financing options that are cheaper than hire purchase agreements. With convenient locations in San Fernando, Tobago, Arima, and our lifestyle showroom in Barataria, you're never far from the best deals. Visit PCU Plus today and discover why we're the top choice for quality furniture and appliances. PCU Plus. Quality you trust, prices you'll love. Visit one of our locations or find us online to start transforming your home today.
Take some time for yourself or spend some time with the family at Sandy Point Village Hotel. Enjoy our various studio and suite apartments, self-contained with their own kitchenettes and Wi-Fi. We also have our famous 100-foot swimming pool and our beachfront restaurant, the Steak and Lobster Grill. And our location in Crown Point puts us near the center of activity, from the nylon pool to the local nightlife. Call us and make your reservations at 639-8533, 389-2378, or email us at sandypointvillagehotel@gmail.com.
If these walls could talk, they'd cry uncle. They didn't plan to become offices or yoga studios. But they've stood by us, even when we got a little stir-crazy. For that, they deserve some thanks. They deserve Benjamin Moore.
You are watching Strictly Legal on WESN Content Capital. Just give an overview of what exactly is that split arrangement.
Now you don't need to register nothing. You don't need. We can do that another time. But then it becomes a hit, and then everybody starts to want to claim.
The laws that predate many of the independent countries' constitutions are going to be those colonial laws.
We know there are an infinite amount of circumstances that would lead to a murder.
I have a great idea and, I have a great concept, but until it's actually expressed, it does not become intellectual property.
Accomplishments or targets of a forensic accountant is to quantify what may have been lost.
They believe we defend criminals and we manipulated the law and we exploited the system.
A responsible journalist will reach out to the person who they have the information on for a comment.
This is Face of Sports, WESN Content Capital. How you felt about the kiss on the lip?
That's the business. I'm nothing to do with that.
I find that was distasteful.
The national senior team, whether you like it or not, that is the model for all other teams to follow.
I'm assuming that the regional requirement may be a much stricter requirement.
This is not about Pro League and Super League. This is a league run by the Normalization Committee that I'm responsible for.
Nobody expected FIFA to fund this arrangement.
If we don't get a professional attitude towards this, we are doomed for failure.
You break the balance, trip the leg, control the body.
They ain't gonna stand put
Why
forever.
you want the Chiefs to lose so? Why you want the Chiefs to lose so?
They already have two. Lamar don't
Why?
have.
You're jealous because you know the Chiefs getting closer to the Patriots. Let's go to the last part.
No,
of the game.
not no.
Let's go to the last part.
And we're back here talking about the WSN Content Capital Show. Michael Small joined with a different media ambassador today, but someone who those of you who are faithful viewers of the show should recognize this gentleman. He is Inspector Kurt Callender. Good morning, sir. Welcome to Talking Point. As usual, outdressing me once again.
Well, thank you so very much. Welcome to you and welcome to our viewers and listeners in Trinidad and Tobago and wherever they are in the world. It's always a pleasure to be back here representing the TTPS.
Now, you have come willingly to speak on a very contentious topic with what has happened last week. Now, there was a lot of things in the press last week that directly or indirectly, to some extent, maybe even, unfairly, in one case, that comes to mind, to some extent, slightly, doesn't make the TTPS make it out in a good light. The PCA's report on domestic violence, of course, is one of those things. Now, to some extent, it's a report. To what degree is it an investigation that will then lead to convictions? That's a whole different ballgame, right? So I just want to put that out there. But it is somewhat disappointing because at the very least, there has to be a little bit of truth in it, even if it's not all 100% completely, going to lead to convictions. A little bit of truth in it. I'm a little bit disappointed because I thought domestic violence, not so much the level of domestic violence in the country, but the police response to domestic violence was a bright spot on the surface, on the service, or for the service, where it seemed as though the special unit, the gender-based violence unit, special victims and whatnot, they were doing good work, and one of the issues were victims now coming forward so that they can do the work, right? So with regards to domestic violence, I guess one of the things is, if you want to just go through the whole situation for us.
Right, well, what I can tell you, though, is that having had several conversations with the last head of the gender-based violence unit, the PCS report primarily was before the establishment of the Special Victims Department.
Right.
So in 2020, the Commissioner of Police launched a specialized unit in the TTPS to investigate intimate partner violence, namely the gender-based violence unit. And in 2021, the unit was amalgamated with the Child Protection Unit and the Sexual Offences Unit. This unit is now referred to as the Special Victims Department. And officers, they were highly trained and continue to be trained. So the officers are very victim-centered and perpetrator-focused, right? So the Commissioner of Police and the executive, in their wisdom, saw the need to do something even before that PCA report came out, because the feedback that they would have been getting is that more needs to be done, more has to be done. So we are not dismissing the PCA's report. We are not dismissing some of what the PCA report said. We are saying that we adopted a proactive approach so that victims should not become a victim twice.
Yes.
You understand? Because they're already a victim, they should not be a victim of the system. And we hold our officers in high regard as it relates to how not only the victims, but how victims and perpetrators of domestic violence ought to be treated. In other words, what is the standard operating procedure? And on the 21st of February 2024, the Commissioner of Police, Mr. Zilla Haywood Christopher, signed off on a policy document that is pretty much a step-by-step guideline as to how officers should treat reports of domestic violence.
But generally speaking, I think there are specialists in each station or division to kind of be directed these cases to, correct?
Right, that is the Special Victims Department.
And this should not necessarily completely solve some of the things in the report, but it would at least significantly reduce some of the claims where police didn't take the complaint seriously, which to some extent historically people would have gotten wind of, but then also, and this is something which I think in the current environment, even though the report might be dated, it's something that people will read and see and not necessarily want to think, oh, well, it happened then and it's not happening now, where police involved in the situation might use their position to try to cover it up.
Let me explain. Every day before 8 a.m., officers attached to the Special Victims Department, they have to call every stations in the division where they function and operate to inquire if there is any report of domestic violence that was reported during the last 24 hours in that particular station district. So for example, in the Eastern Division where I'm attached, the Special Victims Department is attached to the Sangre Police Station.
Right.
There are 9 police stations in Sangre, and all of those 9 stations, they are required to report all reports of domestic violence, intimate partner violence to the Special Victim Department. And even if they don't, the officers attached to the Special Victims Department, they also contact those 9 stations when they pick up duty to inquire if there were any reports at all of domestic violence. So that is one of the standard operating procedures. But we also have to bear in mind that the officers attached to the Special Victim Department, they do not function and operate in the charge room in every station because it is a specialist section. So the manual that the Commissioner of Police would have signed off on the 21st of February 2024 is a step-by-step guide for all police officers as it relates to when reports of domestic violence are made in the station, or if they have to go on the scene of a report of domestic violence, what are they required to do on arrival at that scene. So that manual is there to guide the officers when it comes to reports of domestic, and it is very detailed, it is very comprehensive as it relates to what the officers are required to do.
Now, I'm not too sure, because I would assume, you would have looked into, like you said, you spoke to the former head, you would have looked into the Special Victims Unit, how it's operating, where this PCA report came from, and how, what is the reality versus of both how the police are handling things today. When the report came out, you looked into all those details. So I don't know if you're necessarily prepared to answer this question, but again, one of the things that came out, and it just so happened to come out within the same week that a couple of police officers had a very interestingly foolish idea to commit a kidnapping with a police vehicle. And to some extent, I actually, the situation has some irony, because I'm like, listen, maybe those 2 guys weren't going to be good police officers, even if they stayed on the straight and narrow to make a decision not foolish. But it compounds with the perception coming from the PCA reports where some officers might have been abusing their power, right? There was also a court matter last week where a judge was quoted saying that some officers abuse their power in a case where they didn't have a search warrant, et cetera, et cetera. The reason why I say that is to put this matter to bed, to reassure the population, especially given what happened last week, which I guess is, I don't know if it's an unfortunate coincidence or somebody arranging things with a certain timing. Has anything been said beyond the Commissioner's direct responses on the kidnapping with regards to situations like this? Because I think one of the issues with the domestic violence victims is, of course, understandably, for the police to try to get them to come forward, right? We know that. Same thing with extortion. It's an uphill battle because people are afraid, just in general. Even if the police were working, perfectly, people would be afraid to come forward. That's just the nature of the situation. Or reluctant to because it's a family member. And then now any sort of perception that, well, if the police is involved, I might not get a fair shake, or things might be covered up or something like that, just adds to that burden. Has there been any response internally by the service to address those concerns? Or, to some extent, as you pointed out, didn't necessarily need a response this week because we've already put things, or you've already put things in place to kind of try to treat with these things from beforehand?
Well, I just want to create the distinction between the two. So the first issue you mentioned was the 2 police officers that was arrested relative to their involvement in a kidnapping. That matter is presently ongoing and presently under investigation. So I cannot say much more on that.
I just said that for context.
But in relation to reports, any reports of domestic violence, even if the Special Victims Department, they are not the first responders, you also have inspectors and sergeants attached to, or in some instances, in charge of stations. So if it is the victim believes that they may not get a fair shake from the first responder or from the TTPS in general, they can request to speak to the sergeant or the inspector.
Right.
And if it is they believe they are still getting the runaround, you have the Professional Standards Bureau and you also have the Police Complaints Authority. But I want to give the public out there the assurance that once that information reaches to the level of the sergeant or the inspector in charge of a station, they can be rest assured that he or she is going to treat with that matter with a level of urgency and seriousness in which it deserves. And they would most likely not have to go further than that, because the sergeant or the inspector would now cause follow-up to be done, have a conversation with the shift supervisor, have a conversation with the investigator. Tell me, you tell me, give me an update as to what is taking place with this investigation. How far have you reached? What have you done so far? What are the resources you require in order to complete this investigation? Because we know, we are fully aware as an organization, and we understand that domestic violence can lead to a homicide. You understand? That is how serious we treat with reports of domestic violence. So if it is not intimate partner violence and it involves siblings, children, as the case may be, there is a particular level of seriousness. And this is what I was speaking about earlier. The policy, which has now been uploaded to the TTPS portal, where every single police officer in Trinidad and Tobago has access to. They can go on that portal, click on that manual, and read it from cover to cover, beginning to end, and be guided, be so guided and instructed by what it says as it relates to what they are required to do. So it is not a case where they are not aware or the information is there. And the shift supervisors, the corporals, the sergeant, and the inspectors in charge of the station, it is their responsibility to ensure that lectures are held with their junior officers so that they are everybody is on the same page and brought up to speed as to when a report of domestic violence is made to you, the police officer, be it by telephone, be it by an informant, be it that you responded to a report of domestic violence. This is the standard operating procedure in which you are guided by, and you will be held accountable if you don't.
And just so people could be aware, right, because I think to some extent not everybody will understand a domestic violence case and the potential, like you said, it could lead to murder, right? It's a very tricky situation. Not just how to proceed with regards to trying to safeguard the victim, but even just to communicate with the victim, right? So I don't know if you could further enlighten the public, like exactly what are some of the challenges that makes this thing so tricky, because it's not just, okay, the police are whatever. It's like, no. There are legit challenges to this that just goes beyond how good or bad the service is, that any average police officer anywhere will have to deal with, and most likely on a reasonable level, not deal with perfectly 100% of the time, because it's so subjective and challenging.
Well, I'm so happy or glad that you asked that, because we do have challenges. And the main challenges that we have as police officers investigating reports of domestic violence is the full cooperation of the victim. Without a cooperative victim, you don't have a case. And there's only so far you can go to continue or even to complete your inquiry. So you may have, you would be required to visit the scene, interview the victim, record statements from the victim, as well as witnesses. But if the victim is not prepared to give a statement, and that victim is not prepared to cooperate fully with the investigation, for a varying degree of reasons, of course, and that may be quite rightly or wrongly so, because they may be fearful.
Yeah.
If the victim is saying, well, no, I just wanted to warn the person, they are not prepared to give a statement, they are not prepared to go and seek medical attention, they are not prepared to be photographed because they may have injuries and so on, you cannot force them to give a statement because that statement is voluntary. You cannot force them to seek medical attention, and you cannot force them to be photographed. So your investigation is pretty much stalled, and you really cannot continue, or there's only so much you can do without a cooperative victim.
Well, there's a couple of things there with what you just said. First of all, I think in a normal crime, say I'm robbed, I don't want to give a statement, there really isn't anything you could do about it. And to some extent, like, I don't think it's unreasonable for the police to say, well, if this person doesn't want the police to do anything about their robbery, why should we want to do anything about their robbery, right? Like, I don't expect a police officer to then go above the call of duty to try to get somehow a resolution of a case that I am completely uninterested in. And for this analogy to work, might even tell you I don't want police involvement, right? Because in domestic violence, that's what could happen. The victim might say, no. Nothing happened. They deny things happen. Maybe they lie for the perpetrator, right? Because the initial report could be from someone else, a concerned family member, whatever. But it's not so simple for the police for domestic violence report to just say, well, we wash our hands of it.
No,
You can't necessarily proceed, but we're in this kind of catch-22 where to some extent there's a responsibility to try to find reasonable ways to move forward with a case, right?
Well,
as limited as it might be.
I would have studied in depth intimate partner violence. It is not that simple for a victim of domestic violence. That is not how the brain or the mind of a victim of domestic violence works. Because of the fact that we have to adopt what is called the victim-centered approach, we have to refer them to the Victim and Witness Support Unit in the Trinidad and Tobago Police Service to offer some type of psychosocial support to the victim and even the families of victims of domestic violence. So sometimes, from that angle, the victims may realize, well, wait a minute, if I allow this to continue, I can be killed. If I allow this to continue, there would be psychological and emotional trauma, not only for me, but my family and my children. So from that angle, you might get some level of cooperation.
Okay,
but that again is if they are even willing to accept the assistance from the Victim and Witness Support Unit.
There's another thing that you said there, which I find to be interesting. When they just want, I assume it's the victim just wants the perpetrator to get a warning.
Yes.
To me, in my mind, once you involve the police, and maybe this is just because of what I've seen on TV and read in stories or whatever, but to some extent, even in real life, if a victim involves the police, one of the first things the perpetrator is probably going to do is come back and commit violence to punish the victim for saying anything to the police. And I don't know to what extent, because you're concerned about essentially murder or murder-suicides. And one of the things that I try to tell people is, look, from the moment somebody considers a murder-suicide situation, there's very little a police could do in that situation, right? Like, for that crime after the fact. Right. You need something before it happens to trigger a police response. You can't just respond to murder-suicide. The perpetrator has killed himself. You can't arrest a dead man. You can't punish a dead man. So, to what extent am I correct in saying it's very, very risky for a victim to want to just give him a warning? Because one would assume they're still in a domestic situation where they're still much closer to the perpetrator than the police are in order to intervene.
You are absolutely correct. Now, domestic violence knows no boundaries at all. So many people believe that it is very simple for the victim to just pack up and leave. Why doesn't he leave? Why doesn't she leave?
Right.
Now, and it has nothing to do with their financial status. They are politicians, pastors, judges, magistrates, are all victims of domestic violence. Imams, pundits, you name it, persons who are well off, well-to-do in society. So money is not the issue. Money is not the issue. Domestic violence is all about coercion and control. If you only leave, I'm going to kill you. If you only leave, you're taking my children. You understand? So that fear is constantly, is forever embedded in their mind, the back of their mind. Look, if I leave this person, they say they are going to kill me.
And
I will not be able to see my children. Could be
kids
harmed.
could be used as held to ransom, rhetorically speaking.
Correct.
What if they commit violence against them?
Exactly. So, for example, we have to offer, to indicate to the victim, we are going to put you in a safe house. But they are studying, what about my children?
Yeah, yeah.
Would my children be able to accompany me? Would he or she know where I would be staying? How are the children going to go to school? If the children go to school, would he or she have access to the children?
Right, custody. Is that something that's straightforward? Is there a straightforward policy, or is that more a tricky situation?
Well, it is a very tricky situation, because that is a matter that has to go to court. So the court grants what you call an interim protection order or a protection order. And it can be granted ex parte, which means in the absence of the respondent. Once the court is satisfied, there's reasonable grounds to indicate, well, the victim is in danger. Right? So you grant that interim protection order. It has the same weight, the same validity as a protection order. And it stipulates all the things that the respondent ought not to do. But he has to be served a copy in order for him to be, he or she to be in breach of it, because domestic violence, the victim and perpetrator is either male or female. In most instances, we always refer to the victim as the she, but the victim is also a male.
Could be, yeah.
So I just want to put that out there. If that person is not served a copy of the order, he or she would not be aware that there's an order in force and that he or she is in breach of the order.
So technically, they have to be safe to be in breach. But I just want to point out, an interim order is not necessarily a proclamation of guilt.
No.
There can be situations where the court grants it as a preventative measure, but the person could technically be not just technically innocent, but actually innocent, potentially, right?
Yes.
It's just a way to try to ensure that you don't want to take the risk of escalation.
Correct.
Now, I guess the last thing I want to ask before we take a break and then open the phone lines after. One of the things I think that makes it tricky, and I don't know to what extent you could speak to this, because this is where it might get very subjective. It's one thing if, your partner has been beating you multiple times or psychologically abusing you for years. To some extent, an expert could say, look, these are the signs. It's very objectively clear. You're being abused. We would like to help you do something about it. But what about instances where, and it just occurred to me, like if it was one instance where randomly, maybe the woman hit the guy or the guy hit the woman, but it's not like a pattern, but rather a one-off. What would normally be the advice to people in that situation? Because I can understand the point. I myself do think once you kind of cross that line, it's very, very hard, no matter how reasonable you are as a person, to uncross that line, which is why you should not go there in the first place. But I'm not going to, human beings are varied and complicated and are not all the same. So I'm not saying it's impossible for a situation where reasonable, well-intentioned people can't lose their cool and have a one-off incident. But for the police now, what do you advise people that might find themselves in a situation where, they just hit me yesterday and I don't know what to do?
Well, as the old people say, right, the things that you could see in the day, don't wait until nighttime come to take flashlight or flambeau to look for it. Those are red flags. And they probably were there all the time, and you probably missed those red flags because you were either in love or you are in love, you are afraid, you have nowhere to go, stuff like that. So we would always advise persons, you see, where anytime a relationship reaches a stage where someone in the relationship resorts to violence, what else do you need to see in order to run away from that or get yourself out of that? Because no amount of apologies is a guarantee that it won't happen again. and it might even be more severe. It could result in your life.
And in fact, it doesn't have to be big man hitting small woman. It could be small woman, 5'0" woman hitting a 6'4", 300-pound man. Because the irony of the situation is, ironically, some people might say, well, the man is safe in that situation, so what are you fretting about? Well, you just pointed out, if she wants to escalate because she feels my fist ain't hitting him enough, so I'll use a blunt object or a knife, and then more importantly, if he defends himself now, potentially the outcome might get him into hot water.
That's right. And of course, we always advise them, both parties, to seek counseling as well. And we also refer them to the Victim and Witness Support Unit. So we could only do so much on our end with the cooperation of the victim as much as we can.
Is it a good advice, at least in that specific example, where the man technically has a clear physical advantage? If a man is so much more bigger than a woman, who the woman is, this is just an obvious example. It's probably good advice to tell any men caught in that situation, don't hit back. Just remove yourself and don't take the risk of escalating things further. I know it's not so simple if the positions were reversed for the woman not to fight back if she feels that threatened, right? Because that might be the difference between her survival or not. But for a man who potentially could absorb the blows once it doesn't get to escalate to a certain point, it's best that don't even engage. Just remove yourself, get the police involved, let the police kind of handle.
Yes.
And then once you've left the situation, man or woman, let the police handle, listen, we're separating, I need to get my stuff, I need to sort out my life. I have the police involved to kind of keep the two sides apart.
Yeah, that is always a very good advice. But sadly, and this is the research said, so not me.
Right. Provocation
is also one of the factors that contributes to domestic violence. As they say, a woman's mouth is her strength. So again, not I said so.
Yes.
They are well documented research, which, I mean, if time permits, I cannot get into it now. But provocation is one of the factors that contributes to domestic violence. So the woman may not be physical, you understand, but the provocation part, you understand, the mouth,
we have to take a break, but one of the things, I don't always agree with people, Goldberg, especially not recently, but she said something that I fully agree with a while back. She said it's never okay for a man to hit a woman. But a woman, when she does something, specifically hitting a man, she needs to be prepared to hit back. Whether it's okay or not doesn't matter. Right. And I do wonder if to some extent, it's just one of those things where you see it a lot, where a woman kind of maybe assumes that, well, a man shouldn't hit me, so I can say whatever I want. And we're not saying that it's right for the man to do so. We're just saying if you provoke someone, regardless of if it's right or not, you need to be prepared that they will retaliate in some form or fashion. I guess that's essentially what this is saying.
Yes, and then in addition to that, research also tells you that a man or a victim or a perpetrator who grew up in a house, in a home, witnessing domestic violence, either the mother beating the father or the father beating the mother, more often than not, they come out, when they enter into their relationship, they also become the perpetrator. And it also says for the victim, if they grow up in a house where there is domestic violence, in many instances, research have shown that they end up in abusive relationships.
They look for it almost.
Well, I wouldn't say look for
it. But they accept it more easily. Because to some extent, it seems more normal than for people who are not...
Well, I guess more normal might be the word.
Not normal, just more acceptable. Yeah.
And again, this is what the research is saying.
Yes.
Not I am saying so.
Yes. And therein lies, I think, we could end with that note, at least this part of the discussion, why for people in a household with domestic violence, one of the arguments is not just your safety, because I think some of the victims think, well, beating me, not beating the kids. But it's like, hold on, even if the kids don't get hits, the psychological impact to them might be so severe, they might end up being victims themselves in the future, or perpetrators themselves in the future.
Because we more often than not, we speak about the primary victim, but we do not mention the secondary and tertiary victims. And many women would tell you they were not aware that they were a victim of domestic violence because beating is normal in a relationship. That's what they grew up seeing.
Yes, I've heard this before.
As well as the man.
I think from...
Well, I didn't know I was committing an offense. That's how I see my mother does deal with my father deal with my mother.
I think maybe Ashraf might have mentioned this, like some women have, which I myself don't understand. If he don't beat me, he don't love me.
Well, I would have heard that before, but that is what they grew up seeing. So for them, that is normal in a relationship.
And folks, that's just the challenges. So we'll take a short break. When we come back, we'll open the phone lines. Stay tuned. This is talking about the WESN. We'll be right back after this.
Seven is out, all day is in. WESN News on the hour.
Join me, Dr. Nalini Kokram, on What's Up Doc, where we discuss all your burning questions concerning health.
Trinidad and Tobago is among one of the highest risk group of patients that develop this form of genetic breast cancer.
What I'd like to take home from a short interview like this, screening. You must screen.
Because it's silent.
It's silent.
Yeah.
And because it's silent, you don't know it's there.
What's Up Doc, every Tuesday and Thursday on WESN, Content Capital.
And we're back here on talking about the WSND Contact Capital. Sean Michael Small here alongside Inspector Kirk Callender from the TTPS, who has, as per tradition, agreed to stay for calls. So you could call in, and if you have any questions to the TTPS, hopefully the inspector can answer them. Please note, and every now and then I do have to give you a reminder, he is not the Commissioner of Police. So don't ask him to speak on what the Commissioner of Police is thinking or what her motivations are. That's beyond what he could talk about. And of course, depending, if a case is ongoing, while we may not like the policy to some extent, we cannot expect the inspector, who is probably not the officer involved, to be able to provide us with details of the case as it is ongoing. So just remember that. But like I said, the phone lines are open. You can call in, have your say. You could ask us questions on whatever it is that you want to ask. It is up to you. Just remember to mute your television when you are speaking to us on the phone. Do not try to listen to the conversation and communicate to us while listening to the television. It will be confusing because there's a delay. Now, as we wait for calls, and hopefully I don't get a call immediately after I say this, but Inspector Callender, you do still want to highlight what domestic violence is, because we kind of touched on it a bit as we closed, and we spoke about it during the break. People just might not be aware of what it is. Like we said, some women think, if you don't beat me, you don't love me, which to me seems kind of crazy that it's still happening in 2024, but apparently it still is happening in 2024.
Yes, it is. Well, according to the United Nations definition, it says gender-based violence refers to harmful acts directed at an individual based on their gender. It is rooted in gender inequality, the abuse of power, and harmful norms. Gender-based violence can include sexual, physical, mental, and economic harm inflicted in public or in private. It also includes the threat of violence, coercion, and manipulation. This can take many forms, such as intimate partner violence, sexual violence, child marriage, and female genital mutilation. That is not primarily in our culture, but they are in other cultures.
Our affiliate, France 24, it seems almost like once a month or once a week, they have a segment on female gender mutilation, which to some extent horrifies me, the fact that it happens frequently enough for them to report on it so frequently.
Yep. And of course, the definition of domestic violence in accordance with our Domestic Violence Act 45 of 56 as amended by 18 of 2020, it says is any physical, sexual, emotional, psychological, or financial abuse committed by a respondent against a person who is in a domestic relationship with the respondent. Under the said Act, domestic relationship is defined as a relationship between a respondent and a person, where the person is in relation to the respondent a spouse or former spouse, a cohabitant or former cohabitant, a child, dependent, a relative, a person who has agreed to marry the respondent whether or not the agreement has been terminated. Of course, when I hear the word cohabitant or former cohabitant, in Trinidad and Tobago, there is a Cohabital Relationship Act that pretty much legalizes it, for want of a better word,
common law?
Common law relationships.
Right.
So even if you are not married, but you are living in a common law relationship steadily for 5 years or more, the law recognizes that. And even if you are not married, the domestic abuse against a cohabitant or former cohabitant is an offense. But the act goes further because it mentions something what you call a visiting relationship or a dating relationship.
Right, yeah.
Right, so in the past, the law didn't really recognize that because they said, well, you all are not living together and you all are not married. So it's technically not intimate partner violence, but because of the fact the research has shown that, look, these persons are also being abused by their intimate partners. The law has now taken that into consideration and included them in the amendment to the Domestic Violence Act, and they are now covered. And of course, it gives a definition for who is what is a visiting relationship and a dating relationship and so on. So even though you are in a relationship with somebody, but you visit their place of residence from time to time, you are not living together. You might sleep overnight once or twice for the week. As the case may be, you are now covered under the Domestic Violence Act. And of course, the dating relationship is if you are dating someone for a particular period of time, you are now covered if there are any acts of violence against you. So the amendment has cast a wider net and offer a greater level of protection to those persons as well.
One of the things that you said, harmful acts of a sexual, physical, mental, or economic nature.
Yes.
But I think, like, some people might not understand that there are those who do this domestic violence, that some people might think, oh, well, that should be obvious. But what I think people might agree on not being quite as obvious. Yes, when you're the victim of mental abuse, it might be harder to recognize. But I think economic abuse might be one of those where people really, it's just not on people's radar.
No, it's not.
And it's one of those funny things when it's not on your radar, you might not even consider it, right? You might even think that you're being treated unfairly, but you're not thinking it's gone to the point where this is a form of abuse, which I guess, as you may have kind of alluded to, one form of abuse could turn into another, right? So, I mean, is it that it's also to some extent subjective? Because sometimes you have people that enter into unequal relationships financial-wise.
Right.
And then, of course, I've read stories online where, say, you know, one member is richer and the other party has demands on his wealth, and when he doesn't accede or she doesn't accede to those demands, it's financial abuse.
You are quite correct. So there are a lot of gray areas there, and as you quite rightly mentioned, it could be somewhat subjective. At what stage does it become financial abuse? So, I mean, you are married to a woman, but you all had some misunderstanding whether or not you were unfaithful to her. And she decided, look, I am going to withhold having any sexual relationship with you because you went outside. I don't know who you went with, what the person has, and so on, so I'm protecting myself. And of course, the typical response might be, well, if you are giving me nothing, I'm not giving you nothing. So you withhold your finances from her to purchase groceries, see about the children, and so on. So the law may look at that and say, well, no, well, that is financial abuse because she has to the children has to be taken care of, they have to be fed, the wife have to be taken care of, and so on. So that might be one example. But of course, there are some persons who might be thinking, well, I want more. You understand?
Yes.
The cost of living going up, so I want more.
I just want more money.
Yes, I just want more money.
I want a bigger wedding.
Or a bigger house, a new car.
And ironically, I think this is where the mental abuse, because when you said withhold any sort of sexual intercourse, that depending is also subjective and could be a form of mental abuse.
Exactly.
You're not giving me more, so I'm going to withhold, you know. But then you're still demanding, but stay faithful to me, don't cheat now.
Right.
You know, don't break up with me now, right? But suffer under not being allowed to have any sort of physical intimacy because you're not giving me more.
Well, I just want to say something. It might be scary for most men out there who are married. If you have sexual intercourse with your wife without a consent, you can be charged for rape.
Yeah.
So I just want to put that out there, guys who are married. You have to get a consent, your wife.
Is there any concern that TV, Hollywood, movies, you know, they kind of make it out, technically, yes, you're married.
Yes.
Right? And then there's always like some shows with a gray area where essentially, and usually it's the guy, right, is forcing their wife to have sexual relations. And then what happens is the show kind of normalizes it because the woman accepts it halfway through.
Yep.
You know? Yep. And then is there any concern now from your point of view, from the authorities, that, look, fiction sometimes is telling men, listen, sometimes no is really yes. Like, this is one of the ways where the no means yes thing, I think, is continue to be perpetuated. And it's one thing if, all right, I'm watching a show where that happens. It's a whole other thing if I actually, you know, make that assumption myself. Yeah, it worked out for the guy in the show, but the guy in the show could fight 10 men at one time and not get hurt, and he's a billionaire, right?
Right.
That's not reality. Reality says if she says no,
it's no.
99.9999999999999, and probably that's too low, right? Means no.
Is no. But again, the other side of the coin is it is her word against his, because there are instances where the man would say, well, no, I never heard her said no. I got her consent. So is a he says, she say kind of something. And that is what makes it difficult for the police.
And let's just say, even if there is this 0.0001% of women who it actually does mean yes,
right.
Generally speaking, you don't assume,
no.
You don't hope, and even if she told you in the past that, you know, when I say no, I mean yes, you kind of should still assume that a no is a no, right? Even if she tells you counter, you should tell her, no, let's not play that game.
Yeah, once you say no.
Because even if the woman does mean it, then there could come a point in time when she actually does mean no.
Correct.
Right? And then what happens? I guess you could say, to some extent, sometimes these things could get very subjective because of the games that the man or woman plays.
You are correct. I mean, because some people do foreplay, they spice it up, they do all kind of kinky stuff in the bedroom. So you really, to you, well, you had consent to do all that. But they may come and she say, but no, I told you no, but you're always telling me no and you mean yes. So once you say no, no is no. That is what the law says.
Well, we're coming to the close of the show. I guess this is not necessarily a topic that a lot of people want to call in on. I don't know if it hit too close to home.
Too close to home.
And I guess that's one of the other things. I'll be straight with you. One of my complaints with regards whenever your leadership says, well, major crimes are down, I'm like, that's reported. We already know domestic violence and the other one, extortion. The police are trying to get people to come forward more.
There's the extortion hotline now you could call.
Right. So with regards to domestic violence, is it that we as a society are not necessarily too sure how widespread the problem is? Because I think, ironically, one of the I'm not going to say it's a consequence as though it's a negative, but one of the consequences of the gender-based violence unit and the special victims unit is that perhaps the problem is seen to well enough that it's not necessarily like growing out of control, like how the murder rate has. But perhaps it is also, we don't necessarily know how widespread it is, and maybe if we kind of knew how widespread it is, people might be more encouraged, because to what extent do victims be like, well, no one will believe me because, you know, this is the sort of thing. They don't see that public, they don't see publicly that victims get heard, that the public will back them up. What they see might be too much of, because I know of a case where the family, the family essentially protected the perpetrator because the perpetrator and the victim were relatives.
I will now comment to that. There is a well-documented study, I think it was done by a Canadian company, if I'm not mistaken, as it relates to domestic violence in Trinidad and Tobago. Well, they cover the whole Caribbean, but I just going specific to Trinidad. Well, that study I had to read when I was studying for my bachelor's. And coming out of that study, it's quite scary and frightening, some of the things that came out of that study. What it basically is saying is that domestic violence is a deeply rooted cultural, societal issue in Trinidad and Tobago that is fueled and encouraged by us as a society. And you mentioned one of the pertinent points where the perpetrator is protected by his family, because mothers then go in and sell out the child and say, well, I see my son hit his wife, and vice versa. You understand? And there's a culture whereby men own women in Trinidad and Tobago, treat them like the property. Well, that's my woman, I own you, I can tell you what to wear, where to go, where come here, go there, as the case may be. So it is fuel and encouraged in our society.
And I just want to interject. Usually, isn't it very hypocritical when the one spouse that thinks I own you, they themselves half the time feel free to, if necessary, go forth and seek comfort elsewhere whenever they want. They own you. You can't cheat on them, but they could cheat on you. Or you can't leave them, but they could cheat on you while you have to remain faithful and stuck to them.
And that is also encouraged in our society. Culture is it is a cultural thing where a man is referred to as macho. It's okay for him to have 3 and 4 women. But if a woman knows that she is a, well, I know the age word that is used.
You know, academically speaking, I understand all this, but there's a part of me that doesn't get it at all, right? And I know someone in a situation like that, right? Or close enough to that. So I know that it's reality, but for you to say, and I think I did see and read that report, we spoke on it on a different show on the network that predated Talking Point. So I think when it came up to the public attention, right? But seeing some of the things in that report, because I was a production assistant on that show for WSN. I agree with you. I think it was one of those things where I blissfully forgot what it said because it's not something that you want to remember.
Correct.
And I don't know what else to say. I guess this is one of the cases where, dare I say, crime as a public health issue. One could argue like this is kind of like what it means to deal with stuff that's culturally ingrained.
Yeah, and hence the reason we can no longer say, you see me, I'm not getting involved in husband and wife business. We can no longer say that because domestic violence transcends all boundaries and it affects everybody. There is the primary victim, but who speaks about the secondary victim, who are the children, the siblings, and the community, as well as the co-workers of the victim of domestic violence when they die. All the signs were there, and some of those persons knew and they ignored it. When the persons die, the one person, the common denominator that takes the blame is the police. Well, the police didn't do this and the police didn't do that, but the police could only go as far as the victim was cooperative enough to allow the police to go. You understand? But so there would continue to be a public outcry and a public outrage as it relates to the dispensation of justice for victims of domestic violence. But the public outrage and outcry extend to, I am going to provide a home for the victim. I am going to provide a job for the victim. I am going to secure the victim's children. How come the outrage didn't extend to that far? Because the brain and the mind of the victim of a domestic violence don't work there so where they could just pack up and leave and say, you see, you are left in you and I go. That is not how it works for them. They are a constant overthinker. So unless these societal issues are not addressed, the criminogenic issues may never be addressed. Because for the victim of domestic violence, it's more a societal and psychosocial issue rather than a criminogenic issue. If those things are not addressed, we as police officers will continue to spin top in mud.
And I'll just say this. Yes, there can be anecdotal examples, particularly things have been published in the past where you could say it's clear the police dropped the ball, but the key point is anecdotal. Don't let the actions of one officer then say, well, the whole service is like this. In part, so that victims don't be discouraged to, as you said, if you think you're getting run around, go up the chain, go to the sergeant, go to the supervisor, what have you. But also to the public, okay, you may have one example of a bad apple. It's not the whole story, because then I think not only does it unfairly discredit the service. Look, when you have something that's accurate, that's fine, but to say it, because then people will assume, well, if it's like this in one case, it's like that in all cases. Not only is that unfair, but it also then causes the whole criminal justice system to not work properly when people are making generalized assumptions that are not true. Because, as you said, the research points to the fact that a lot of the time, it's the victim's unwillingness to come forward or people to report. And to close, I'll have one example. I remember when I was small, so technically speaking, I don't know if I had any business trying to be involved in this anyway. Right outside my house, a woman was in distress in her car. Now, because she was in her car, right, and I think that at the time there was a daycare operating on the corner of my street.
Right.
I might have been somewhere anywhere between 9 and 15 at the time. I can't remember how old I was exactly. I did kind of wonder if that was, well, ironically, a domestic situation, and I shouldn't be involved, right? In part because I'm a child, even if I'm a young teenager. I don't know nothing. I don't know why am I going to think? Well, you know what? Ironically, and this is a tangential example, apparently what happened was it was two young men in the area that basically did a car invasion and robbed of a purse.
Right.
So that's just to show how far it could go. Not only are you thinking, oh, well, I don't want to get involved in a domestic situation. Well, as you pointed out, it could escalate to murder, or maybe it's not a domestic situation. Just because a woman who maybe is living alone or has a boyfriend is crying out a certain way, it might not be domestic violence, it could be a home invasion. So reporting it could go even a step further. It could be beyond a domestic violence situation and to just a major crime situation.
Yep, and I just want to encourage persons who are in domestic relationships to don't remain in them. Reach out to the police service. The Special Victims Division have highly trained police officers who adopt a victim-centered approach and a perpetrator to get to the perpetrators and so on. And we also have police officers who are trained in gender-responsive policing, right? So the one is it involves intimate partner violence, the Special Victims Department. They are expertly led, very professional, highly trained, and they are going to treat with all intimate partner violence reports with the urgency and the seriousness in which it deserves, and give the victims the necessary assistance that they need in order to get their lives back on track. So it's not just about bringing the perpetrator before the court, but assisting you along with other stakeholders. For example, the Victim and Witness Support Unit, we have the other social support services within Trinidad and Tobago that they work closely with, along with the victim, to give them that assistance they require to not only get them out of that abusive situation, but to assist them in getting them back on their feet. You understand? So you are not alone. You are not alone, and I really want to encourage the victims out there to pick up that phone, make that report, reach out to the TTPS, help us to help you.
And for my example, I probably was a teenager, which means, because I do think I had a capacity to make a determination. I made the wrong one, although I'm not entirely too sure what I could have done then, but now I would advise people, community watchers, groups, I think they all encourage their members to have air horns.
Yes.
You know, at least be willing, if something like what I just described happens outside your house, have the air horn at the ready. And if it's a child that might be, you know, sometimes your kids might see something around the house, you might not see it. Perhaps parents need to kind of have a talk with their kids. Listen, not to go into all the details of crime or whatever, but if these things happen,
yes,
come to me, yes, right? Don't just observe it, or even worst case scenario, a child decides to involve themselves in something like that.
Well, Sean, there are private security companies now that go into communities and they offer packages. So depending on the amount of people that sign up, you can actually get a security camera to monitor outside your home,
yeah,
and the street where you live for about $100 a month. And you have access to it on your phone. I mean, I'm not promoting any security company. I won't mention the name.
Yeah.
You have access to it on your phone, and you could also engage the air horn from on your phone as well.
Right. $100 a month is per person or just in the total?
$100 a month per person.
Per person.
Yeah.
I mean, listen, there's power in having cameras. Yes,
Yes.
it might not prevent the crime from happening, but you catch 2 or 3 robbers, all of a sudden they get the memo. This is not the street to try and rob.
Correct.
Folks, with that said, I want to thank Inspector Connor for joining me to have this in-depth conversation. Man did his homework for this topic. And of course, this domestic violence situation, it's one of those things, hopefully, that we do not forget about. Yes, the murder rate gets a lot of press, but as we saw from the pandemic, part of the murder rate also comes from the overall situation, which is in some ways even more challenging than general murder in and of itself. So, with that said, make today a good day. As Mr. Shah would always say, remember your allegiance to the Republic and to each other, particularly with regards to domestic violence. If you are a victim, you will want someone to help you and to go to the police on your behalf, which is why we should all try to do so in those situations for others as well. Stay safe out there. Be mindful about dengue. Hopefully the heat wave has passed. Try and not waste water. We have a dry season coming up. That might be one of the ways. We will see you tomorrow. Bye-bye.
WESN.
Money is something we all deal with, but how many of us truly understand it? What if you could make better decisions with your money? Decisions that secure your future, protect your family, and bring you peace of mind. I'm Darren Jacobs, and I'm here to help you make sense of your dollars. Welcome to Dollars and Cents, the show that breaks down the financial world in ways that matter to you. No jargon, no confusion, just real conversations about money, your money. So join me every Wednesday at 10 a.m. on WESN for Dollars and Cents.